The purpose of the Pilgrims' journey to America and the colony they settled there was not religious freedom or glory. Instead, the sole purpose was to make as much money as possible, at least officially. The reason that this may surprise you or seem untrue is because though we are all familiar with the Pilgrims, who settled in New England and built their colony in the New World, most people don't know that the colony would never have survived if it were not for people 2,000 miles away back in England who made the whole endeavor possible. Today we will be discussing the force which led to the creation of not only Plymouth, but most of the other British colonies in America: money. Have you ever wondered how the Pilgrims were able to afford the many costs which came with building a colony from scratch? To mention a few of their purchases, they bought large stashes of food and provisions, weapons, ammunition, armor, and cannons to defend themselves from outside threats, tools to build houses and plow fields, and hired 2 ships to transport them across the ocean. Before traveling to America, the Pilgrims were poor and hardly had the funds for all or even half of these things. Luckily for them, they did not need to. That is because in England, colonies were using a revolutionary new method to fund themselves: joint stock companies. Contrary to popular belief, the English colonies were not funded by the King of England, nor were they directly owned by him, at least not yet. Instead, the colonies were treated as a business endeavor where a group of wealthy English businessmen, also known as adventurers, would pool their funds together into a company, each purchasing a portion of it in the form of shares or stocks. These funds would be used to send colonists across the ocean and support them until they would become self-reliant. Once the colony would begin making money, the profits would be split between those who had invested in the company. The more of the company you owned in stocks, the higher percent of the profits you would gain. This method had already been used in Jamestown, found Virginia. The Pilgrims decided to use this method to fund their colony, and plenty of English businessmen were ready to invest into this company. However, before they could sail to America and build a colony, they would need permission from the King of England in the form of a patent. This is due to the fact that England already claimed the area the Pilgrims wanted to land in, and to move there without the king's permission would be illegal and likely cause the destruction of the colony. So how were they supposed to get this patent? To understand this, we must first understand what New England was like before the Pilgrims got there. In 1606, the King of England granted 2 companies charters to colonize in North America. The first was composed of London residents, while the second was from Plymouth, England. Thus, they were called the London and Plymouth Companies respectively. The London Company could settle in the south, while the Plymouth Company was allowed to settle in the north. Both could settle in the lands which are now New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Both were joint stock companies, and some of the leading figures in the Plymouth Company were Sir Ferdinando Gorges and Sir John Popham. Each company had a council appointed by the King's Council, and they had the power to govern the colonies, as did the king. Both companies rushed to settle a colony in their territory. The Plymouth Company was the first to make an attempt when 4 months after receiving the charter, Sir Ferdinando Gorges sent a vessel of 29 Englishmen to settle in America. He instructed the captain to take the northern route to cross the ocean. The captain disobeyed and was immediately captured by the Spanish when he tried going through the Caribbean, ending the company's first attempt at colonization with a completely preventable disaster. Other attempts were made by the Plymouth Company, but unlike their London counterparts, they were unable to establish and maintain a permanent colony in America. This was the state of the Plymouth Company when the Pilgrims began seeking a patent, investors, and recognition for their colony. They sent John Carver and Robert Cushman to London, hoping they would return with the king's seal of approval. This was attained, but they did not receive his formal blessing to practice their dissident religion. He did, however, make it clear that he would not actively prevent them from practicing their radical branch of Puritanism, and that was the best that they were going to get from him. Now they had to iron out the details and secure a formal patent. This became a lengthy process that could not be finished until they had assembled all of the necessary investors. Upon hearing of the planned colony, the Dutch, whose land the Pilgrims currently lived in, proposed that they instead settle under the Dutch flag, but this was rejected because the Pilgrims were still culturally English, despite having fled that country, and wanted to retain that identity. They were also approached by an English merchant named Thomas Weston. The Pilgrims decided that Weston and his associates were suitable investors and thus reached an agreement and formed their company. The agreement, which became the subject of bitter controversy, created a joint stock divided into shares of £10 each Each person over 16 years of age who went as an emigrant received 1 share free, and second if he fitted himself out to that amount, or paid for his transportation. On the one hand, the results of the entire labor of the colonists were to go to this joint fund, and, on the other, all their food, clothing, and necessities were to be provided for them out of the stock. At the end of the 7 years, the entire fund, with its accumulations, including the houses, lands, and cash on hand, was to be divided proportionally among all the shareholders, the expectation being that the profits would accrue mainly from fishing and Indian trade. The Pilgrims set sail for America aboard the Mayflower in September of 1620. Their patent was for modern-day Manhattan, where they intended to settle their colony at the mouth of the Hudson River. Of course, things did not play out that way. The Mayflower was blown north into New England, and instead of landing in New York, they ended up in Plymouth. This made their previous patent invalid since it fell out of the bounds of the company they had received their patent from. This is because the Virginia Company, the one that the Plymouth Company was a part of, had its borders redrawn, and now New England was under the jurisdiction of the Council for New England, another joint stock company. The businessmen in England quickly received another patent, this time for New England. The colonists began building their colony with the construction of a common house. At the start, everything was built in common, with the fields and buildings being shared and worked on collaboratively. However, as the relentless winter ravaged the colony, this system was abandoned because the leaders reasoned that the construction would go quicker if everyone was in charge of building their own house. Half of them died over the winter as disease and the elements brought the colony to its knees. Yet they survived, and after making it through the worst of their troubles, they were met with good luck. They were able to make an alliance with a local Indian chief named Massasoit, who aided the Pilgrims and sent men to help them adapt to their new environment. Soon the once starving settlement began to prosper with a surplus of food. They celebrated by hosting the first Thanksgiving feast. However, by this point they had still not made any money. They were surviving and growing, but they still had bills to pay to those who had raised the money to send them over in the first place. In order to start making a profit, they began trading with the Indians and hunting so as to get their hands on one extremely profitable good: beaver skins. The pelts were desired all across Europe, and the Pilgrims tapped into this lucrative market to pay off their debts. They sent a ship back packed with goods, worth about 500 pounds total, off to England as their first contribution to the company. For reference, the entire company had less than 7,000 pounds invested in it total. The Pilgrims were off to a good start and could begin generating a profit for those back in the mother country. Or at least, that would have been true if the ship sent back had not been captured by the French and had all 500 pounds worth of goods taken. Within a year of the arrival of the Pilgrims, the English investors back in London began to become agitated with the colony. To their disappointment, the Pilgrims did not send back anything of value aboard the Mayflower when it returned to England. Of course, at that point, the colony was starving, poor, lost half of their population, and had nothing of value to send back to the merchants. Then, once the colony began trading and fur trapping, the fruits of their labor were stolen by the French before they could make it home. Even after a year, the colony still failed to generate any revenue for those back in England. Yet the stakeholders continued to send ships with settlers over to the colony, which helped it grow, but also raised the burden for food, which they had already struggled with meeting beforehand. Thomas Weston, the man they had originally come to an agreement with, sold his stock in the company to his associates since Plymouth was not generating the rapid profits he had hoped for. He would go on to try to form a competing colony of his own right next to Plymouth. This was a complete catastrophe, and not only did Weston's settlement fail, it also turned the Indians against both themselves and the Pilgrims, and almost led to a coalition of tribes forming against them. Even after all of this, when Weston was captured by the Indians and had all of his belongings taken from him and his venture bankrupt, the Pilgrims welcomed the man into their settlement and lent him money so he could get back onto his feet. In most cases, the Pilgrims acted independently of the companies and councils above them. However, at some points these organizations did get involved with the colony. John Pierce, the man whose name the Pilgrims' patent was under, maneuvered to the point where he legally became the owner of the land the Pilgrims were settled on. He sent a ship back of over 100 men to America, but the ship was unable to make it and turned back. The Pilgrims complained to the Council of New England, and ended up paying the man 500 pounds in order to regain the right to their lands. Periodically, the council would send over officials with meaningless titles who would arrive and not be taken too seriously before often returning home. By 1623, the flaws in the plan for the joint stock company began to show. In accordance with their agreement with the investors, the settlers were to live a virtually socialistic life, sharing everything in common for the first 7 years. Then the profits of the company were to be totaled and divided according to the number of shares held. But by 1623, many were complaining that the industrious ones were working to support the lazy ones. It was decided to give every man, woman, and child the use of 1 acre of land, though they would still cultivate in the greater common lands for the company as well. As time went on, the colonists' relations with the English investors only decayed. The Pilgrims only acquired more and more debt despite sending back shipments of goods for the company. Many of the investors sold their shares at a loss out of fear they would never turn a profit. As a result, fewer and fewer colonists were being sent over by the company as time went on. This upset the Pilgrims because the majority of their congregation still lived in the Netherlands, where they had initially sought refuge from English persecution. These people were the friends and family of those who lived in Plymouth, and they wanted to join them in America but could not afford the journey themselves. Both the Pilgrims and the investors were unhappy, so they decided to simply end the company as it was. Negotiations between the colonists and stockholders began, and the colonists agreed to buy out the investors. The investors sold all of their shares in the company for £1,800, along with the debts the colonists already owed, and agreed to renounce all claims to the land the Pilgrims were settled on. In order to pay off this massive debt, Plymouth's leading men, along with 4 of the investors who still wished to associate with the colony, collectively agreed to take on the debt in return for some monopolies such as for the fur trade. Finally, the colonists owned their own land, and the operation ceased to be merely about raising a profit and instead became a very unique colony. It had no royal governor or outside corporate interests, and instead the people elected all of their own leaders. Soon after, the Pilgrims were granted a new patent, this time in the name of their governor, William Bradford, and his associates. Unlike the previous ones, this patent outlined specific territorial boundaries for the colony and was overall much more specific than those which preceded it. When we learn about the success of Plymouth and its importance in American history, we often overlook the massive contributions made by English investors and businessmen. If it were not for them, the Pilgrims would never have made it across the ocean and been able to found their colony. We often forget these men because they are not as flashy or exciting as the trailblazers and pioneers, yet they were still nonetheless vital. James Truslow Adams describes it best. The infant colony was the child of 2 parents, and the share of each in its creation must be recognized, even if one were vulgar and sordid, and subsequently disinherited its offspring.